Megan?
Ed, thank you. Bret Stephens is a foreign affairs columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and Joe Hicks is a former civil rights leader and vice president of Community Advocates. Welcome, gentlemen. Joe, let me start with you. The president speaks of how racism is deeply rooted in our country's history and then seems to be tying that to these cases by suggesting that young men of color have less margin for error, and that, I suppose, is something he thinks we've learned from Ferguson and Staten Island.
You know, it seems like whenever the president weighs in, whether it's the situation with, Henry Louis Gates up at Harvard, or Trayvon Martin saying he would have looked like a young Trayvon Martin, he always weighs in a way that people can take almost what they want to hear out of it. And here, clearly, any activists that are listening hear the message that, you know, if you're black in America, you got a rough road to hoe. So it feeds into this victimization kind of ideology that all too many people in this country have that are black and that are activists, and that's really very unfortunate. You'd think after 6 years, the president would have figured out and been able to utilize his biracial background to weigh in a far more progressive kind of way on this. Very disappointing kind of comments, I think, from the president here.
What do you make of it, Bret? I mean, his remarks sounded pretty down on the state of things in America, and yet the polls seem to bear him out, that race relations have gotten worse under his presidency, according to the voters.
Look, I mean, obviously, we are no longer living in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Obviously, there's been tremendous racial progress, Megan. But I think one point that needs to be made, I'm the foreign affairs columnist of the Wall Street Journal. I've lived all over the world. I've traveled all over the world. I think the United States is almost certainly the least racist country I have ever lived in. I mean, maybe you could point to a handful of exceptions, but I'm hard-pressed to think about them. And it would be good to have the president take note of that fact. I think it would also be good to have the president take note of the fact that what happened in Ferguson, what happened in Staten Island was many things, but it was not really centrally a racial issue. I mean, you can talk about the level of force that police are inclined to use. You can talk about what's going on in inner city communities, black-on-black violence. There are all kinds of issues. I happen to agree with Eric Garner's family in saying that this is, if nothing else, this was not a black and white issue in both senses, both the literal and the metaphorical sense of that comment.
Isn't that extraordinary, Joe, that you've got the family of Eric Garner saying this is not a black and white issue, and yet the president and the mayor of New York, among others, are suggesting it is?
It's very significant, and I guess this family of Eric Garner hasn't gotten the memo from Al Sharpton yet, because I'm sure he'll have them singing a different tune very, very quickly. But yeah, it's very significant, I think, that you hear this dour, down, sour note kind of thing. We're hearing from the mayor of New York as well as from the president of the country. Yet you have a couple of relatively unsophisticated working people who just out of the gate tend to see it in a much more different way. And I think that says something very significant about the leadership ranks of this country, the elites of this country, and what people are down at the grassroots in a daily kind of way tend to see things very, very different.
And whether this is being used by some, like Mr. Sharpton, to promote an agenda of their own as opposed to in an effort to really get to the bottom of what happened. Gentlemen, good to see you.
Good to be here.
Well, the president also weighed in on what he called bias in police departments. And up next,